While every she-wolf fought for the alpha king's attention at the mating ceremony, I was the outcast Nanny, secretly caring for the royal pups. Then, the castle doors slammed shut, and the grieving, ruthless king walked into the nursery to mark me as his mate. This is a story about a powerful, broken king trapped by his crown, and the forgotten servant girl who holds the secret to healing his soul. Get ready for a story of forbidden touches, forced proximity, and a fated bond that will either save the kingdom or start a war. I promise, the tension and the steam in this one are unforgettable. Before we dive in, make sure you like this video and subscribe to @romantasy Shelfie Collections so you never miss a moment of the romance. Now let's get into it. Chapter 1. The Shadow Nanny. The sound of the grand ball was a distant, muffled heartbeat. Laughter, the swell of string music, and the clinking of crystal glasses bled through the thick stone walls of the castle, faint ghosts of a life I could never be a part of. Here, in the quiet warmth of the royal nursery, the only sounds were the soft crackle of the hearth and the gentle, sleeping breaths of the two most important souls in my world. Leo, with his father's stormy black hair, was sprawled on his back in his crib, one chubby arm thrown over his head in total surrender to sleep. His twin sister, Lyra, was curled into a perfect crescent moon, her silver blonde hair a stark contrast to her brother's, a soft, painful echo of the late queen. They were the Alpha King's pups, the heirs to the entire Leakin kingdom, and they were the only reason I was allowed to remain within these walls. My name is Seraphina, though most here don't bother to use it. I am simply the nanny. I am a shadow in the halls, a whisper of faded lavender and chamomile, the scent of the calming herbs I use to soothe the children. I am also an outcast. In a world where a she-wolf's worth is measured by the strength of her line and her ability to produce strong heirs, I was rumored to be barren. A wolf without a future. My family line was weak, disgraced generations ago, and my own failure to present as a fertile omega had sealed my fate. I was a ghost long before I felt like one. While every other unmated she-wolf of status was downstairs at the grand mating ceremony, preening and posturing for the Alpha King, I was here. This ceremony, held 5 years after the tragic death of his first mate, was a political necessity. The kingdom needed a queen. King Theron needed a new mate to solidify alliances and warm his bed. The entire kingdom buzzed with it, speculating which highborn lady would win the ultimate prize. I felt no jealousy, only a quiet, aching resignation. My world was the nursery. My purpose was these pups. I smoothed the blanket over Leo's chest, my calloused fingers brushing his soft cheek. A fierce, protective love, so potent it was a physical pain, swelled in my chest. They were my pups in all but blood. I had been their nanny since the day they were born, the one constant in their motherless lives. Their first steps were taken towards me, their first words spoken to me. I knew their fears, their favorite stories, the exact way to hold them to chase away a nightmare. "He won't choose her, you know," a voice whispered from the doorway. It was Alara, a kind, elderly servant who sometimes brought me my meals. She held a small tray with a piece of leftover bread and a cup of watered-down wine. "Lady Isolde. She's beautiful, but her soul is as cold as a winter stone. The king may be a beast, but he's not a fool." "It's not my place to wonder, Alara," I murmured, though my heart gave a small, traitorous leap of hope at the thought of the cruel Lady Isolde being denied. She had looked at me with particular disdain more than once, as if my very presence was an insult to the castle's heir. "Nonsense. You have more heart and soul than any of those peacocks downstairs," Alara sniffed, setting the tray down. "The king would be lucky to have a mate who could love his pups as you do." I offered her a weak, grateful smile. It was a kind fantasy, but a fantasy nonetheless. The Alpha King Theron was a force of nature, a warrior king burdened by a grief that had sharpened his temper and hardened his heart. I had only ever seen him from a distance, or in brief, terrifyingly formal encounters when he came to see the children. His power was a physical presence, an oppressive weight that made the air crackle. He was a king bothered by his crown, and his stormy gray eyes saw everything and nothing at all. They had certainly never once, in 5 years, truly seen me. As Alara left, Lyra began to stir in her crib, a soft whimper escaping her lips. I was at her side in an instant, my hand resting on her back. "Shoo, my little moonbeam," I whispered, stroking her soft hair. "I'm here." She settled, but the ball downstairs seemed to grow louder, the energy of it seeping into the room. A storm was brewing outside, the wind beginning to howl around the turrets. It was a restless, charged night, and as I held my breath, listening to the sleeping children, I felt a strange, primal hum in my own blood, a deep and forgotten instinct stirring in response to the magic of the mating moon. Chapter 2. The Scent of Home. The hours bled into one another, marked only by the shifting shadows cast by the fire. The distant music had finally faded, signaling the end of the mating ceremony. I wondered, with a detached sort of melancholy, who was now the kingdom's queen-to-be, whose life had just been irrevocably changed. My own remained the same, a constant, quiet orbit around two sleeping children. A deep weariness settled into my bones. Lyra had been restless, plagued by small nightmares that made her whimper and cry out. I had spent the last hour humming a soft lullaby, my hand a constant, soothing weight on her back until she finally drifted back into a deep, untroubled sleep. I was slumped in the rocking chair beside her crib, my head resting against the high, carved back, my eyes heavy. The storm outside had broken in full force, rain lashing against the thick castle windows. The wind howled like a mournful wolf, a lonely sound that echoed the emptiness in my own chest. I must have drifted off, lulled by the storm and the warmth of the fire. I was woken by a click. The nursery door, which was never locked, had been pushed open. My heart leaped into my throat. I expected to see Alara or one of the night guards checking in. But the figure that filled the doorway was not a servant. It was the alphaking. He was a silhouette against the dim light of the hallway, a massive, intimidating presence that seemed to shrink the very room. My entire body went rigid. I had never been alone with him before. He was still in his formal, black ceremony tunic, but it was unlaced at the throat, and he had pulled off the heavy circlet of his crown. His dark hair was disheveled, and he moved with a bone-deep weariness that I had never seen on him. He looked less like a king, and more like a wolf weighed down by the pelt he wore. My first instinct was to become invisible. I shrank back into the shadows of the rocking chair, praying he was only here for the pups and would not even notice me. He took a step into the room, his eyes going immediately to the cribs. A flicker of something soft, something paternal and deeply pained, crossed his features as he looked at his sleeping children. He took another step, and then he froze. His head, which had been bowed in thought, snapped up. His whole body went unnaturally still, every line of him radiating a sudden, dangerous tension. His nostrils flared. I watched, paralyzed with a new kind of fear, as his gaze left the pups and began to sweep the room, not as a king surveying his domain, but as a predator hunting a scent. His stormy gray eyes, which had always seemed to skim past me, landed on me. And for the first time, they didn't just pass over. They locked. They saw. A low growl rumbled in his chest, so deep it vibrated in the floorboards, in the very air I was struggling to breathe. It wasn't a growl of anger, but of something far more confusing and primal. It was a sound of pure, possessive recognition. He took a slow, deliberate step towards me. The air around him seemed to crackle and shift. The weary, burdened man was gone, replaced by the raw, untamed power of the alpha. His eyes, which were usually the color of a storm-tossed sea, began to bleed at the edges with a molten, glowing gold. It was his wolf, clawing its way to the surface. "What is that scent?" he rasped, his voice a rough, broken thing. I couldn't speak. My throat was closed with terror. The scent in the room hadn't changed. It was the same as always. Firewood, sleeping children, and the faint herbal scent of me. He stalked closer, his gaze burning, stripping away my invisibility, my carefully constructed walls of servitude. He was looking at me as if he'd never seen me before, and in a way he hadn't. He stopped directly in front of my chair, close enough that I was enveloped in his scent, ozone from the storm, rich pine, and a dark, masculine musk that was overwhelmingly dominant, overwhelmingly alpha. He inhaled deeply, his eyes closing for a fraction of a second. A tremor ran through his powerful frame. "It's you," he breathed, the words a mix of horror and dawning, impossible reverence. All night, through all the perfumes and the desperation, I kept smelling it. Home. His golden eyes snapped open and stared into mine. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. And then his wolf spoke, a single, guttural word that was not spoken with his mouth but seemed to erupt from his very soul, a primal claim that bypassed my ears and branded itself directly onto my heart. Mine. Chapter 3. The Unwanted Claim. The word mine was not a suggestion. It was a statement of absolute, undeniable fact. It slammed into me with the force of a physical blow, shattering the quiet, ordered world I had so carefully constructed. My mind, my human consciousness, screamed in terror and disbelief. This was the Alpha King. I was a barren outcast. It was impossible. But my wolf, a creature so deeply buried beneath layers of shame and resignation I barely knew she existed, rose up on instinct. She did not cower. She did not flee. She recognized the call of her mate, the other half of her soul, and she answered with a silent, shocking surge of pure, unadulterated joy. King Theron was caught in his own storm. The man and the wolf were at war within him, and his face was a terrifying mask of their conflict. His eyes, now almost entirely molten gold, burned with the wolf's possessive, primal need. But his mouth was twisted into a grimace of human denial, his jaw clenched so tightly I was surprised his teeth didn't crack. No, he growled at himself, taking a staggering step back as if trying to physically escape the truth his senses were screaming at him. It cannot be. Not you. The insult, so casual and so absolute, was a shard of ice in my heart, extinguishing my wolf's brief, joyful flame. Not you. He saw me, finally, and all he saw was someone unworthy. The familiar, cold cloak of shame wrapped around me again. Of course. How could the mighty Alpha King be fated to a barren nanny from a disgraced line? It wasn't a blessing. It was a cosmic joke, a flaw in the fabric of the fates. But the mating bond, newly awakened and savagely powerful, cared nothing for his denial or my shame. It was a living entity, a crackling, golden cord that had just snapped taut between us. I could feel him. I felt the deep, aching grief for his first mate that was his constant companion. I felt the crushing weight of his crown, the profound loneliness of his power, and I felt the tidal wave of raw, desperate lust that his wolf felt for me, its fated mate. It was a shocking, intrusive intimacy that left me breathless. He must have felt my own emotions in return, the terror, the shame, the flicker of my wolf's hope, because another growl was ripped from his chest. He was a caged animal, and I was the key and the lock, the answer and the problem all in one. The ceremony, I whispered, the words trembling. You were supposed to choose someone. I could not, he snarled, raking a hand through his dark hair. None of them, they all smelled of ambition and lies. My wolf wanted none of them. It wanted. His eyes locked on me again, a fresh wave of horror and desire warring in their depths. It wanted to come home. The raw confession, torn from him by the power of the bond, sent a tremor through me. For a moment, just a moment, I allowed myself to feel what it would be like to be his home, his solace. The moment was shattered when Lyra whimpered in her sleep, disturbed by the volatile energy that had saturated her sanctuary. Theron's attention snapped to his daughter, and the Alpha's fury was instantly banked by the father's concern. He took a step toward her crib, but the bond between us yanked him back like an invisible chain. He couldn't move far from me. The proximity was a requirement, not a choice. A look of pure, trapped desperation crossed his face. He was the most powerful being in the kingdom, and he was a prisoner in his own children's nursery. This changes nothing, he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing command. The king was reasserting his control over the wolf. You will not speak of this to anyone. No one can know. The council, my allies, they would never accept it. You are unsuitable. Each word was a careful, deliberate blow. He wasn't just rejecting me. He was outlining the political reality that made our bond a catastrophe. He stalked towards me again, and this time I flinched, pressing myself back into the chair. He stopped, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. I cannot. I will not mark you. But the bond is here. He said the words as if they were a curse. I cannot leave, and neither can you. He turned away from me, his broad back a rigid wall of denial. He walked to the fireplace, bracing his arms on the mantelpiece, his head bowed. He was a king cornered by his own heart. I sat in the shadows, my world irrevocably broken and remade in the span of 10 minutes. I was the fated mate of the Alpha King, and he was my captor, a man who would rather be a prisoner himself than ever publicly claim me as his own. Chapter 4: A Gilded Cage. The first rays of dawn crept through the nursery window, painting the room in pale, unforgiving shades of gray. The long, silent night had been a unique form of torture. King Theron had not left. He couldn't. He had taken up a silent, brooding vigil in an armchair by the window, as far from me as the room would allow, a formidable shadow of contained rage. I had remained in the rocking chair, not daring to move, every nerve ending alive and screaming. The air was thick with our commingled scents, a volatile perfume of my fear and his furious, unwilling desire. The bond was a constant, humming presence, feeding me the chaotic storm of his thoughts. He was appalled. His wolf was ecstatic. The king was calculating the political fallout of this disaster, while the beast within him was simply reveling in the proximity of its mate. To feel his inner turmoil so keenly was a violation, yet it also gave me a terrifying insight into the man behind the crown. He was trapped, and he was furious about it. When the first servant, a young girl named Anya, came to the door with the pup's morning milk, the king moved with startling speed. He met her at the door, blocking her view of the room and of me. "The nursery is under quarantine," he commanded, his voice a low, authoritative rumble that permitted no questions. "A fever has been reported. No one is to enter or leave except for Alara. She will attend to the children. See to it." Anya's eyes went wide with fear, and she scurried away, whispering about a royal quarantine. And just like that, my world shrank to the four walls of the nursery. It had once been my sanctuary. Now it was a gilded cage, and the Alpha King was my warden. The pups woke soon after, their cheerful, babbling voices a stark contrast to the suffocating tension in the room. When Leo stood up in his crib and made grabby hands towards his father, a look of profound pain crossed Theron's face. He went to his son, his movements stiff, and lifted the boy into his arms. The powerful king was a natural father, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he checked Leo over. My heart ached. This was the man beneath the beast and the crown. A grieving widow, a loving father. As he held his son, his gaze drifted over to me. For a moment, the fury in his eyes softened, replaced by a raw, bewildered expression. He was looking at me, then at his son, as if trying to solve an impossible equation. The proximity was a slow, exquisite torture for us both. When I went to lift Lyra from her crib, he was standing nearby, and my arm brushed against his. A jolt of pure, electric energy shot between us, a stark reminder of the bond's physical power. We both recoiled as if burned. His scent, that intoxicating mix of pine and storm, seemed to cling to my skin, and I saw his pupils dilate, the gold of his wolf flaring in response to my closeness. This was our new reality, a small room, 2 innocent children, and a chasm of unspoken, unwanted passion that threatened to consume us with every accidental touch, every shared glance. Later that morning, Alara arrived, her face a mask of professional concern that didn't quite hide the knowing, worried look in her eyes. She had clearly been chosen for her discretion. Theron gave her brisk instructions about meals and supplies, his tone leaving no doubt that she was to speak to no one. As he was distracted, I busied myself changing Lyra's linen. My hands trembled as I worked. I was so focused on the simple, familiar task that I didn't sense him approach until he was standing right behind me. "Let me," he said, his voice a low rasp near my ear. He reached around me to take the fresh linen, his broad chest pressing against my back for a fraction of a second. The contact was electric. A gasp escaped my lips, and I felt his entire body go rigid behind me. I could feel the heat of him, the hard wall of his muscle. The bond flared, and a wave of his raw, undiluted desire washed over me, so potent it made my knees weak. It wasn't gentle. It was a dark, possessive hunger that wanted to consume, to claim, to mark. He pulled back abruptly, a savage growl rumbling in his chest. "This will not work," he bit out, not to me, but to the universe. He was right. We couldn't live like this, circling each other like caged animals, the air growing thicker with every passing moment. Sooner or later, something was going to break. and I feared with a terrifying certainty that it would be me. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Walls. 3 days. 72 hours spent in the gilded cage of the nursery. The world outside had ceased to exist. Our strange, silent routine was dictated by the pups' needs: waking, playing, eating, sleeping. In the small bubble of their innocence, we were forced to act as a family. Theron would read Leo a story, his deep voice a soothing rumble, while I rocked Lyra to sleep. We would share a silent meal at the small table after they were down, the space between us charged with a tension so thick I could barely swallow. The physical torment of the bond was relentless. We were magnets, constantly fighting a pull that demanded closeness. The denial was fraying him. I could feel his control slipping, the wolf growing more dominant, more insistent. His gaze would linger on me when he thought I wasn't looking, a heated, possessive stare that made my skin tingle. At night, he would sleep in the armchair, but I could feel his wolf's yearning, its desperate desire to climb into the small cot I used and wrap itself around its mate. My own body was a traitor, aching for a touch I knew I should fear. On the 4th day, our suffocating bubble was breached. There was a firm knock on the door. Theron, who was on the floor helping Leo stack wooden blocks, went still. "It is Lady Isolde," a guard's voice announced from the other side. "She has come to see the royal children. She says she will not be turned away by rumors of a minor fever." A string of curses muttered under Theron's breath. He couldn't refuse her without raising suspicion. His political standing was precarious enough without offending the powerful northern houses she represented. "Let her in," he commanded, his voice tight. "But she is to stay for no more than a few minutes." He rose to his full height, the loving father vanishing, replaced instantly by the cold, formidable king. He stood between me and the door as it opened, a human shield. Lady Isolde swept into the room, a vision in crimson silk. Her beauty was sharp and predatory, her smile a perfect, blood-red slash. She smelled of nightshade and ambition. "Your Majesty," she purred, giving him a deep curtsy that displayed her assets. I was so terribly worried. I had to see for myself that the precious heirs were well. Her eyes, the color of chips of ice, swept the room and landed on me. The smile on her face tightened, and a flicker of pure venom crossed her features before being masked again by practiced sweetness. "And the nanny, still here," she said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "How devoted! You must be exhausted." "She is an excellent caregiver," Theron said, his voice flat and dismissive. But Isolde was not so easily deterred. She glided further into the room, her senses sharp. A true high-born she-wolf, she was attuned to the currents of power and scent. I saw her nostrils flare delicately. Her gaze darted between me and the king, a shrewd, calculating look entering her eyes. She could sense it. She might not know what it was, but she could sense that the atmosphere in the nursery was fundamentally wrong. The air was too charged, too thick with a scent that did not belong, the scent of a powerful, possessive alpha marking his territory. "It is so wonderful that you are spending so much time with the children, Your Majesty," she said. Her eyes locked on me. "A king who puts his family first. But you must not neglect your other duties. The pack needs a queen, a strong queen, to secure your line." The emphasis was a direct, pointed dart aimed at my rumored baroness. It was a reminder to the king of what a proper mate should be. She turned to leave, pausing at the door to look back at Theron. "I do hope this quarantine is lifted soon, Your Majesty. The court is whispering. They worry about what secrets are being kept in this room." Her eyes flickered to me one last time, and her smile was no longer sweet. It was a promise of violence. Then she was gone. I stood frozen, the blood draining from my face. The king's rejection was no longer a matter of personal pain or political inconvenience. Isolde knew. She didn't have proof, but her instincts had told her the truth. I was the secret being kept in this room, and she was a wolf who would not hesitate to rip a rival to shreds to get what she wanted. A new, cold dread washed over me. I was not just a prisoner of the Alpha King. I was a target, and the walls of my gilded cage suddenly felt very, very thin. Chapter 6. A King's Fear. The moment the door clicked shut behind Lady Isolde, the fragile peace of the nursery shattered. The scent of her ambitious perfume lingered in the air like a poison, a stark contrast to the familiar, comforting smells of home and hearth. Theron stood with his back to me, his entire body radiating a fury so potent it was a physical heat in the room. The bond, which had been a low hum of tension, now screamed with his rage. "This is what you have done!" he snarled, turning on me. His stormy eyes were dark with accusation. "Your scent, it lingers. It has driven my wolf mad, and now it has drawn sharks to my door. You have made me weak." The injustice of his words was a slap in the face. A spark of defiance, long dormant, ignited in my chest. I rose from the rocking chair, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. "I have done nothing," I said, my voice low but steady, refusing to tremble. "I did not ask for this bond. I did not ask for my scent to call to you. I have spent my life asking for nothing but to be left alone." My defiance seemed to stun him more than any tears could have. He stalked towards me, his superior height and power meant to intimidate, to force me back into my place as a meek and silent servant. But I held my ground. He stopped inches from me, the air between us crackling with a dangerous, volatile energy. "You think I wanted this?" he growled, his voice a low, threatening rasp. "To be bound to a shadow, a barren omega from a disgraced line? You are a political catastrophe. You are the ruin of my kingdom." Each word was designed to wound, to remind me of my worthlessness. But through the bond, I felt the truth beneath his cruelty. It wasn't just anger. It was fear. A deep, primal terror that was so profound it almost buckled his knees. He was afraid of what Isolde might do. He was afraid of his counsel. But most of all, he was afraid of the power of this bond, of the control he was losing over his own heart, his own wolf. His wolf surged forward, a force he could barely contain. His eyes bled to gold. Before he could stop himself, his hand came up, his calloused fingers hovering a hair's breadth from my cheek, near the faint tracing of a scar I'd had since childhood. His expression was one of agonizing conflict, his wolf wanting to soothe, to claim, while the king fought to recoil. With a choked curse, he snatched his hand back as if my skin were flame. He spun away from me, pacing the room like a caged panther. The war within him was brutal, and I was the unwilling battleground. "Ilara!" he roared, striding to the door and pulling it open. The guards outside flinched. "Tell Ilara she alone will bring what is needed. The nanny is to be seen by no one. She is to remain in the deepest part of the nursery. Her existence is a state secret. Do you understand?" The order was cold, absolute. He was trying to erase me again, to push me so far into the shadows that he could pretend I wasn't real. But as he stood there, framed in the doorway, I saw the truth. He wasn't just giving an order to his guards. He was giving it to himself. Chapter 7, The Council's Demands. The king's new decree wrapped the nursery in a thicker shroud of isolation. I was relegated to the small, sleeping alcove I called my own, only emerging when the pups needed me. Theron kept his distance, a brooding, silent presence on the other side of the room. He was a king in self-imposed exile, trapped by a secret that was sleeping on a simple cot just a few feet away. 2 days after Isolde's visit, a more formidable threat arrived. A delegation from the High Council demanded an audience. Theron, his face a mask of stone, met them in the corridor just outside the nursery door, leaving it slightly ajar. He didn't want me to hear, but I crept closer, my heart pounding, straining to listen. "Your Majesty, this cannot continue," came the stern voice of Lord Valerius, the council's grizzled leader. "The mating ceremony was a failure. You made no choice. Now you lock yourself away under the guise of a quarantine no one believes. The kingdom needs a queen. Alliances are fraying. Your line is vulnerable with only 2 heirs." Another voice, younger and sharper, chimed in. "Lady Isolde is the most logical choice. Her father's armies could secure the northern border. An announcement of your betrothal would silence all dissent. The health of my children comes first." Theron's voice was ice. "And a strong queen who can provide more heirs would ensure their future." Valerius pressed. "We need a queen of pure, powerful blood, not a distraction." The unspoken word hung in the air, weakness. They were talking about me, even without knowing it. The barren omega. The distraction. I shrank back from the door, the weight of their words pressing down on me, suffocating me. I wasn't just a political catastrophe for Theron. I was a threat to the entire kingdom. My existence was a betrayal of my duty, a duty I never even knew I had. That night, the stress took its toll on the children. Leo woke with a piercing cry, his small body trembling. It wasn't a simple nightmare. He was calling a name, a ghost's name. "Mama," he sobbed, his little hands reaching for a comfort I could never provide. I rushed to his crib and lifted him into my arms, holding him close, my own heart breaking for him. "Show my little Storm," I whispered, rocking him gently. "I'm here." I began to sing. It was an old lullaby my own mother had sung to me, a simple, sad song about the moon watching over a lost wolf pup. My voice was quiet, unsteady, filled with the sorrow of the past few days. I didn't realize Theron was watching until I felt the intensity of his gaze from across the room. He stood in the shadows, his face unreadable in the dim firelight. He wasn't looking at his crying son. He was looking at me, at the way I held Leo, the way I soothed the child's grief as if it were my own. Through the bond, I felt something shift. It wasn't the raw lust of his wolf or the cold fury of the king. It was a tremor of something else, something deeper and far more dangerous. It was the aching loneliness of a man who saw his own grief mirrored in someone else. He was seeing beyond the nanny, beyond the unsuitable mate, and he was seeing a woman who loved his children with a fierce, unwavering devotion that rivaled his own. And the look in his eyes told me that this emotional connection, the shared moment of parental love, terrified him more than any political threat. Chapter 8. The Breaking Point. A tempest descended upon the castle that night, a violent, raging storm that seemed to be a physical manifestation of the turmoil trapped within the nursery walls. Rain lashed against the windows in furious waves, and the wind shrieked like a banshee. The oppressive atmosphere, combined with the storm, had an ill effect on Lyra. She woke just after midnight, her skin hot to the touch, her breaths coming in short, pained gasps. It was a true fever. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through my exhaustion. "Ilara," I whispered, my first thought to get help, but the nursery was sealed, and the king's orders had been absolute. I was on my own. "What is it?" Theron's voice was a low growl from across the room. He was at the crib in an instant, his usual distance forgotten in the face of his daughter's distress. "She's burning up," I said, my hands already moving, dipping a cloth in a basin of cool water. My training in simple herbal remedies, a skill learned out of necessity in a life of servitude, took over. "Move," he commanded, reaching for his daughter. "No," I said, my voice firm, surprising us both. "You'll jostle her." "Let me." He froze, his authority challenged by the quiet Nanny. But the raw fear for his child in his eyes overrode his pride. He stepped back, giving me space, his powerful presence a storm of anxious energy at my shoulder. We worked in a tense, silent partnership, two parents fighting a common enemy. I bathed her forehead while he held her tiny hand, his huge, scarred fingers looking impossibly large and gentle against hers. For a long, terrifying hour we fought the fever. The small nursery became our entire world. Our arms brushed, our shoulders bumped, each accidental touch a jolt of lightning that the bond amplified, sending waves of awareness shuddering through us. The air grew thick, not just with worry, but with a raw, undeniable intimacy forged in shared fear. Finally, Lyra's breathing evened out. The fever broke, leaving her skin cool and damp. She was sleeping peacefully. Relief washed over me, so potent it left me weak. I sagged against the side of the crib, my head bowed. A hand touched my shoulder. Theron. His touch was hesitant, but warm and solid. "You saved her," he said, his voice a low, rough sound. I looked up at him. We were inches apart, our faces illuminated by the soft, flickering light of a single candle. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the world had gone utterly still. The king was gone. The nanny was gone. There were only two souls, stripped bare by fear and relief. His eyes, more silver than gold now, searched my face. His wolf, soothed by my care for its pup, was a gentle, insistent pressure, not a raging beast. He reached out, his other hand coming up to cup my jaw, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin there. The calloused pad of his thumb brushed against my lower lip, and a soft, involuntary gasp escaped me. Seraphina, he whispered. It was the first time he had ever said my name. It sounded like a prayer and a curse on his lips. He leaned in, his gaze fixed on my mouth. The world narrowed to the space between our lips. This was it, the breaking point. The moment the storm outside would finally breach the walls within. I could feel the surrender in him, the exhaustion of fighting a battle he was always destined to lose. My own eyes fluttered shut in anticipation. Then, with a strangled, guttural sound torn from the depths of his soul, he wrenched himself away. He stumbled back, his chest heaving, his face a mask of self-loathing. "Get to your cot," he snarled, the cruelty a desperate shield. "Now." He turned his back on me, fleeing to the far window and staring out into the storm, his shoulders rigid with the force of his denial. I was left trembling by the crib, my lips burning from a kiss that had never happened, my body aching with a need that had been awakened only to be brutally denied. Chapter 9. Arrival's Venom. The fragile truce forged in the crucible of Lyra's fever shattered with the morning light. Theron was more distant than ever, his silence a heavy, suffocating blanket. He refused to look at me, but I could feel his turmoil through the bond, a confusing, agonizing mix of burning desire and profound self-hatred. He hated that he wanted me. He hated that his wolf saw me not as a political disaster, but as a perfect, worthy mate who had proven her ability to care for his young. That afternoon, Ilara arrived with fresh linens and a basket of food. Tucked amongst the apples was a small, exquisitely carved wooden wolf. "A gift," Ilara said, her face carefully neutral as she presented it. "From Lady Isolde, for the children, to brighten their quarantine." Theron took the toy, his expression one of distaste. He ran a hand over the polished wood before passing it to me to give to Leo, who was playing on the floor. My fingers brushed against the carved wolf, and a strange, cold, tingling sensation shot up my arm. My inner wolf, usually so quiet, recoiled with a silent, instinctual snarl. Something was wrong. I held the toy to my nose. Beneath the scent of wood and polish, there was another smell, faint and acridly bitter. An herb I knew well from my training. "Don't give it to him," I said, my voice sharp. Theron turned, an annoyed scowl on his face. "What is it now?" "The wood," I said, my heart starting to hammer against my ribs. I took a small paring knife from the fruit basket and scraped at the underside of the toy. A dark, oily residue came away on the blade. I held it up for him to see. "It's not just polished. It's been soaked in it. Wolfsbane." The name of the poison hung in the air between us. Theron's face went pale, then darkened with a fury that was colder and more terrifying than any rage I had seen from him before. This wasn't the hot anger of his curse. This was the icy, lethal wrath of a father whose children had been threatened. It wasn't enough to kill an adult, but for a small pup who would inevitably put the toy in his mouth and chew on it, the constant, low dose of poison would have been devastating. It would have sickened him, weakened him, made him waste away. A slow, subtle murder that could be blamed on a mysterious illness. Isolde hadn't just sent a threat, she had sent a weapon. A cruel, vicious attack aimed at the very heart of the king's world. Theron took the poisoned toy from my hand, his knuckles white. He looked from the carving to my face, and I saw a profound shift in his eyes. He saw my quick thinking, my protective instinct. He saw the nanny who had not just saved his daughter from a fever, but his son from a deliberate, malicious attack. He saw Luna. Without a word, he strode to the door and bellowed for his personal guard. "Take this," he commanded, handing the captain the poisoned wolf. "Have the royal apothecary confirm what it is. Then, go to Lady Isolde's chambers. Tell her that her presence is no longer welcome at this court. Tell her that if she ever comes within 100 miles of my children again, I will mount her head on the castle gates myself." The captain's eyes widened, but he bowed and left without question. The threat was brutal, public and absolute. The political ramifications would be immense, but Theron no longer cared. Isolde had crossed a line. He turned back to me, the fury in his eyes banked but still burning. "You are not safe here," he said, his voice a low, gravelly admission. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. A vow. "She will not touch them again," he promised. But as he looked at me, his gaze fierce and possessive, I knew he wasn't just talking about the pups anymore. He was talking about me. Chapter 10. The King's Surrender. The aftermath of a soul's failed attack left a permanent scar on the atmosphere in the nursery. The air was no longer just thick with forbidden desire. It was laced with the chilling reality of mortal danger. We were no longer just a king and a nanny trapped by fate. We were allies, bound by a shared threat against the pups. Against us. Theron's protective instincts, now fully awakened and directed at me as well as the children, were a constant, humming presence in the bond. He watched me with a fierce, possessive intensity that was both terrifying and deeply, traitorously comforting. The pretense was gone. The carefully constructed walls between us had been demolished, leaving only the raw, undeniable truth of our connection. But with that truth came a new, desperate uncertainty. What came next? That night, after the pups were asleep, and the room was cloaked in the quiet intimacy of the late hours, I knew I could no longer be silent. I couldn't live in this limbo, waiting for the next threat, waiting for him to decide my fate. I found him by the window, staring out at the moonlit grounds, the weight of the world on his shoulders. "Your Majesty," I began, my voice quiet but firm. He didn't turn. "Theron," he corrected, his voice rough. "My name is Theron." The offering of his name was an intimacy that sent a shiver down my spine. "Theron," I tried again. "What happens now? You have banished Lady Isolde and angered her powerful family. The council will demand answers. Am I to be your secret forever? Locked away in this room until I am no longer convenient? Am I to be a ghost in my own life?" My voice cracked on the last words, the pain of a lifetime of being invisible finally spilling out. He turned slowly, and the look on his face was one of profound, agonizing conflict. "You are no ghost, Seraphina," he growled, the sound low and guttural. He stalked towards me, his every movement radiating a power he was no longer trying to contain. "You are a fire. You are a constant, burning fever in my blood that I can no longer fight." He backed me against the cold stone wall of the nursery, caging me in with his powerful body. He placed his hands on the wall on either side of my head, his face just inches from mine. I was enveloped in his scent, my senses overwhelmed. "I tried," he rasped, his eyes blazing with a mixture of gold and silver. "By all the gods, I tried to deny this. I tried to hate you. But you are everything my wolf, my soul, has ever craved. You are fiercely protective. You are selfless. You are brave." His gaze dropped to my lips. "And I am done fighting." Before I could breathe, before I could think, his mouth crashed down on mine. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a storm. It was the breaking of a dam, a release of all the grief, loneliness, anger, and desperate, starving desire he had held back for years. It was a raw, savage claiming, a desperate outpouring of the soul. I met his ferocity with my own, my hands coming up to clutch his tunic, pulling him impossibly closer. This was not a choice. It was an inevitability, a surrender. He deepened the kiss, one hand moving from the wall to tangle in my hair, tilting my head back. His other hand slid down my back, pressing me flush against him, letting me feel the hard, undeniable proof of his desire. A whimper escaped my throat, and he answered with a possessive growl. He broke the kiss, only to trail his mouth down my neck, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin where my neck met my shoulder. I knew what was coming. The final, irrevocable act. "Mine," he snarled against my skin, the word of vow and a brand. And then he bit down. Searing, exquisite pain shot through me, followed by a wave of pure, blissful ecstasy as the bond was sealed. His magic, his very essence, flooded my system. The world dissolved into a blinding white light. I cried out his name as my own magic, the gentle, quiet power I never knew I possessed, flowed back into him. I felt him shudder as my essence met his, soothing the ragged edges of his soul, banking the fire of his curse with a gentle, loving calm. He pulled back, his eyes pure, blazing gold. The fresh, bleeding mark on my shoulder pulsed with our now perfected bond. The choice had been made. There was no going back. The outcast Nanny was now, and forever, the Alpha King's mate. Chapter 11. The morning after the storm. I woke to a world that felt fundamentally different. The raging storm outside had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air crisp and cool. The storm inside me had also settled, replaced by a deep, humming certainty that resonated from the fresh, throbbing mark on my shoulder. It was a nexus of power, a direct line to Theron's soul. The chaotic, intrusive static of the new bond was gone, replaced by a calm, steady connection. I could feel his presence, his emotions, not as an invasion, but as a familiar, comforting warmth at the edge of my own consciousness. He was awake, watching me from the armchair he had pulled close to my small cot. The raw hunger and conflict were gone from his eyes. In their place was a profound, soul-deep awe and a tenderness that made my heart ache. "Seraphina," he murmured, his voice a low, intimate rumble that was meant for me alone. He rose and came to kneel by my cot, taking my hand in his. He brought my fingers to his lips, his gaze never leaving mine. It was the gesture of a king, but the reverence in his eyes was that of a devoted mate. "Last night," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "when I marked you, I felt you. Not just the bond, but you. It was like a cool spring rain on a fire that has been burning for a century." His confession was a key, unlocking a part of the journal's prophecy I hadn't understood. The balm for his bloodline's fire. My lineage wasn't just a passive thing. It had an active, calming effect on the curse that had plagued his family for generations. I hadn't just accepted his mark. I had healed a part of him. "The rage," he continued, a look of wonder on his face. "It's still there, the power of it. But it is not a curse. It's quiet. It listens to me. For the first time in my life, I feel like I am the king of my own soul." He leaned in and kissed me, and this time, there was no desperation, no savage claiming. It was a kiss of breathtaking tenderness, a slow, deliberate exploration. It was a promise. When he pulled back, he gently pushed the worn linen of my nightgown aside, exposing the fresh, crimson mark. He traced its edges with a fingertip, a look of profound, possessive pride on his face. "Mine," he whispered again, but this time it was not a snarl of possession. It was a vow of protection. But the new dawn brought with it the cold, hard light of reality. We were still in the nursery. The pups were still sleeping soundly. And the world outside these four walls was a political tinderbox waiting for a spark. "Theron," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "What have you done?" The king returned to his eyes, the weight of his crown settling back onto his brow. "I have done what my soul demanded," he said, his voice firming. "And I will face the consequences." He stood, pulling me to my feet. "But we will face them together." He looked at my simple servant's dress, then at his own rumpled tunic. "The time for hiding is over. The quarantine is broken." The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, blazing hope. He had chosen me. And now, the true battle was about to begin. Chapter 12, The Lion's Den. The castle was a hornet's nest. The news of Lady Isolde's banishment had spread like wildfire, and the subsequent order from the king to convene the High Council in the throne room had sent shockwaves through the court. Rumors flew like crows, each more wild and panicked than the last. Theron had insisted I remain in the nursery with the pups, under the protection of his two most loyal guards. But I couldn't. I was his mate now, not his secret. When he left for the throne room, his face set like granite. I waited 5 minutes before following. Ilara met me in the hallway, a simple but elegant silver-gray gown draped over her arm. "A queen should not face her court in a nanny's uniform," she said, her eyes shining with a fierce pride. She helped me dress, my trembling fingers fumbling with the fine fabric. The gown was modest, but its quality was unmistakable. It was a statement. I was no longer a servant. When I walked into the lion's den of the throne room, I did so not as Seraphina the nanny, but as the king's chosen. The council was already assembled, a severe line of gray-bearded, powerful men led by Lord Valerius. Theron stood before the great stone throne, not sitting on it, facing them like a warrior facing a rival pack. The tension was so thick it was a physical force. My entrance caused a collective, sharp intake of breath. Every lord turned to stare, their expressions ranging from shock to utter contempt. I ignored them, my gaze fixed on Theron. I walked to his side, my head held high, and stood just behind his shoulder. It was a position of support, of unity, a position a queen would take. Lord Valerius's eyes narrowed, his gaze flicking to the stark, new mating mark on my neck. It was a brand of proof, a declaration that could not be denied. "Your Majesty," Valerius said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "You have committed an act of treason against your own kingdom. You have banished the daughter of a key ally and marked this." He gestured to me as if I were a piece of filth. "A Baron Omega. A nobody. You have doomed your line and spat on your duty." "I have fulfilled my destiny," Theron countered, his voice booming in the cavernous hall. "I have found my fated mate, a gift from the goddess herself. She is my queen." "She is a disgrace," another lord shouted. "We will not accept it. We will have the mating annulled." The shouts of agreement echoed off the stone walls. They were circling, while sensing a weakness they could exploit. I could feel Theron's rage building, the curse a low, dangerous hum beneath his skin, ready to lash out. I placed a hand gently on his arm. Through the bond, I sent a wave of calm, a silent plea for control. "I am your bomb. Let me be." He flinched, startled by the clarity of my touch on his soul, but the rage subsided, replaced by a cold, watchful focus. I stepped forward, my heart hammering but my voice clear. "I may be a nobody to you, my lords, but I am his, and that is all the claim I need." My quiet defiance stunned them into silence. Lord Valerius looked at me with a new, dangerous light in his eyes. He saw not a frightened servant, but an unexpected obstacle. "The girl has a tongue," he sneered, "but a tongue cannot produce an heir. Your claim means nothing. The king needs a strong queen, not a barren pet." Chapter 13. A Queen's Revelation. The word "baron" hung in the throne room, a deliberate, venomous poison aimed directly at my heart. It was my deepest shame, the core of my unworthiness, and Lord Valerius wielded it like a blade. The council lords murmured in agreement, their faces hard and unforgiving. I was a dead end, a beautiful, perhaps even brave, but ultimately useless mate for their king. I felt a tremor of despair, a lifetime of insecurity rushing back. I could feel Theron's protective fury surging, ready to defend my honor with violence. But before he could speak, a new voice cut through the tension. "You are mistaken, my lord." Elara stepped forward from the shadows, near the great doors. She was just an old servant, but she moved with an authority that commanded the attention of every wolf in the room. "You speak of things you do not understand." Valerius scoffed. "And you do, old woman. A servant presumes to lecture the High Council." "This servant knew Seraphina's mother, and her mother before her," Elara said, her voice ringing with the power of memory. "I know the truth of her bloodline. You call it weak, disgraced. We call it sacred." She turned her gaze to me, and it was full of a deep, historical reverence. "She is not barren. She is a heart healer, the last of her line." A confused silence fell over the hall. The term was archaic, a name from old legends. "The she-wolves of her line do not present with the crude, obvious fertility of others," Elara explained, her voice like a storyteller weaving a legend. "Their gift is not in the womb, but in the soul. Their magic lies in the ability to soothe, to balance, to heal the spirit. It is a power so rare and potent that it manifests later in life, often only when called by a true mate's need. It is a power that demands a worthy alpha, for a lesser male would be burned by its purity." She looked directly at Theron. "4 generations, the curse of rage has plagued your bloodline, your majesty. An imbalance of fire. The legends promised that a heart healer would one day be fated to your line, not just to be a mate, but to be the cure. Seraphina is not a disgrace to your line. She is its salvation." The throne room was utterly silent. The lord stared at me, no longer seeing a Baron Omega, but a creature of legend, a wielder of a power they couldn't comprehend. Theron looked at me, his eyes wide with a dawning, profound understanding. The calming effect he'd felt, the quieting of his inner rage, it wasn't just a side effect of the bond. It was my magic, my purpose. "It's true," he breathed, his voice filled with awe. He looked at the council, his eyes blazing with a newfound, unshakable certainty. "I have felt it. She has already begun to heal what my ancestors could only endure." Lord Valerius's face was a mask of disbelief and thwarted ambition. The weapon he had used against me had not only failed, but had revealed me to be something far more powerful than any of them had imagined. I was no longer just a political problem. I was a miracle, a living prophecy. And that made me more dangerous to my enemies than ever before. Chapter 14, The King's Gambit. The revelation of my lineage had thrown the council into disarray. They could no longer dismiss me as a worthless stray, but they were not ready to embrace me as a prophesied savior either. Lord Valerius and his faction were temporarily silenced, forced to retreat and regroup in the face of this unexpected turn. But it was a reprieve, not a victory. That evening, the nursery felt less like a cage and more like a war room. The pups were asleep, and Theron and I sat at the small table, a map of the kingdom spread between us. For the first time, he was not just my mate or my king, he was my partner. "Valerius will not give up," Theron said, his finger tracing the northern territories controlled by Isolde's family. "He will paint Alara as a senile loyalist, and your magic as a convenient fantasy. And the northern lords, spurned by Isolde's banishment, will be all too eager to listen. They will call for my abdication. They may even march on the capital." His words were grim, but his voice was steady. The fear that had once haunted him was gone, replaced by a cold, strategic calm. My presence, my magic, had anchored him. "So what do we do?" I asked, my voice quiet. I felt a tremor of fear, but also a strange, fierce determination. This was my fight now, too. He looked up from the map, his gray eyes intense. "We don't wait for them to strike. We force their hand. We make our stand, not in whispers in council meetings, but before the entire kingdom." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "I am calling a grand assembly. I will summon every lord from every territory to the capital. They will be compelled to declare their loyalty or their treason publicly." It was a breathtakingly bold gamble. It would either solidify his rule and my place as queen, or it would ignite a civil war right in the heart of the throne room. "They will challenge you," I whispered. "They will demand proof of my power." "Let them," he said, a wolfish, dangerous smile touching his lips for the first time. He reached across the table and took my hand. "You are my queen, Seraphina. It is time you started to look like one." The next few days were a blur of preparation. While Theron sent out summons and met with his loyal military commanders, he tasked Alara with my education. She brought me gowns of state, jewels from the royal vault, and books of history and law. She taught me the names of the great houses, their alliances, their rivalries. But Theron himself gave me the most important lessons. Each evening, he would take me to the empty throne room. "A queen does not shrink," he would say, his hands on my shoulders, positioning me. "You stand tall. You meet their gaze. You are not asking for their acceptance. You are commanding it." He taught me how to walk, how to speak, how to project an aura of power that I had spent my entire life trying to suppress. He was not trying to change me. He was helping me uncover the queen that had been buried inside all along. One night, standing before the empty throne, he bowed his head to me. "My queen," he said, his voice thick with pride, and for the first time, I truly felt like one. Chapter 15, The Grand Assembly. The great hall was a sea of tension. Every noble house in the kingdom was represented, their colorful banners hanging from the high rafters like silent, judgmental gods. They stood in factions, Theron's known loyalists on one side, the grim-faced northern lords clustered around Isolde's furious father on the other, and a vast, undecided middle ground of wary, opportunistic lords in between. I stood beside the throne, Theron a solid, powerful presence at my side. I wore a gown the color of a stormy sea, the royal crest embroidered in silver over my heart. My hair was up, and the mating mark on my shoulder was proudly, defiantly displayed. I felt hundreds of eyes on me, judging, dissecting, but I met their gazes without flinching, just as Theron had taught me. Lord Valerius, acting as the voice of the dissenters, stepped forward. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice echoing in the silent hall. "You have summoned us here to demand loyalty. But loyalty must be earned. You have broken with tradition, insulted a powerful ally, and taken a mate of unknown value based on an old woman's tales of prophecy." He sneered. "We demand proof. Show us this legendary magic. Make her heal a sick man. Make her calm a beast. Show us that she is more than just a pretty face that has bewitched our king." The challenge was laid. A tense silence fell. They expected a spectacle, a parlor trick. I felt Theron's anger flare, but I placed a hand on his arm, sending a wave of calm through the bond. This was my moment. I stepped forward alone, my footsteps echoing softly on the stone floor. I did not look at Valerius or the hostile lords. I looked out at the entire assembly, at the sea of anxious, uncertain souls. I closed my eyes for a moment and did what I had done on the battlefield of the nursery. I reached out. I didn't focus on one person. I focused on the room itself. The chaotic, aggressive energy, the fear, the ambition, the distrust. It was a storm of negative emotion. I didn't try to crush it. I simply soothed it. I projected a silent, pervasive sense of calm, the feeling of quiet strength, of a deep and abiding peace. It was the essence of my soul, the magic of the heart healers. There was no flash of light, no grand display, but a subtle, profound change swept through the hall. Fists that had been clenched, unclenched. Scowls softened into expressions of confusion. The oppressive, suffocating tension that had filled the room began to evaporate, replaced by a strange, unfamiliar sense of tranquility. The lords looked at each other, a bewildered awareness dawning on their faces. They could feel it. The anger they had walked in with was gone, leaving only a strange stillness in its place. I opened my eyes and met Lord Valerius's gaze. His face was pale, his jaw slack with shock. He had felt it too. "My gift is not a weapon to be demonstrated, my lord," I said, my voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the hall. "It is a shield. It is the balance to the fire. It is the peace that will protect this kingdom from the anger that threatens to tear it apart from within." I walked back to Theron's side. He looked down at me, his eyes filled with a love and pride so fierce it was a physical force. He took my hand and raised it for all to see. "This is my queen," he boomed, his voice resonating with absolute power. "She is the balm for our kingdom's rage. She is the fulfillment of prophecy. She is your salvation. Now, who among you will stand with us?" Chapter 16. An Enemy's Last Gambit. My demonstration of power, as subtle as it was, had a profound and undeniable effect. A wave of murmur swept through the assembly, not of anger, but of awe. The undecided lords, who had come ready for a political battle, now looked at me with a mixture of fear and reverence. I had not performed a trick. I had altered the very emotional landscape of the room. It was a power far greater than any army. One by one, lords from the middle ground faction stepped forward and knelt, pledging their loyalty not just to their king, but to their new, miraculous queen. The tide had turned. Valerius and the northern lords were left isolated, their faction shrinking before their very eyes. But a cornered wolf is the most dangerous. Lord Valerius, his face a mask of cold fury, watched his power base crumble. He shared a look with Isolde's father, Lord Callan, a silent, desperate communication. Then, Valerius raised his hand for silence. "A pretty trick," he spat, his voice laced with venom. "You have soothed our tempers with your witchery, but you have not solved the king's problem. The northern border is still vulnerable. Lord Callan's armies are still the only thing standing between this kingdom and the savage clans of the Frostfang Mountains. You have spurned their alliance. Who will protect us now, your majesty? Your nanny queen and her calming whispers." It was a shrewd, practical attack, designed to sow fear and doubt. Before Theron could respond, Lord Callan himself stepped forward. "Lord Valerius is right," he said, his voice a low, gravelly threat. "My daughter has been dishonored. Our alliance is broken. My armies will no longer protect the Crimson Crown's lands. Let us see how long your newfound peace lasts against Frostfang axes." He turned to leave, a clear, public declaration of secession. It was a final, desperate gambit. Force the king to choose between his mate and the security of his kingdom. "And where will you go, Lord Callan?" Theron's voice cut through the hall, as cold and sharp as ice. "Back to your empty fortress. Back to a home that has been curiously free of Frostfang raids for the last decade, while the king's lands have suffered." Callan froze, his back to the throne. A ripple of confusion went through the assembly. "I have often wondered about that," Theron continued, his voice dangerously soft as he descended the dais steps, circling Callan like a predator. "I wondered how the Frostfang clans, who are known for their savagery, could be so selective in their targets. And then, after a certain poisoned gift was sent to my children, I had my royal guard do some investigating. He stopped in front of Kaelin. They found a traitor, a man who has been secretly supplying the Frostfang clans with food, weapons, and information about our patrol routes for years. A man who used the raids on his neighbors to increase his own importance, to make his army seem indispensable. A man who planned to use his daughter's marriage to the crown to one day put his own treacherous bloodline on the throne. Theron's eyes were chips of flint. They found you, Lord Kaelin. The accusation was a thunderclap. Kaelin spun around, his hand flying to the hilt of his sword, his face a mask of guilty rage. Lies, he roared. Is it? Theron asked, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. Then you will not mind if my guards search your private caravan. I believe they will find several chests of Frostfang silver and a series of coded letters. The game was over. Kaelin and Valerius had not just been outmaneuvered, they had been exposed. The alliance wasn't a shield for the kingdom, it was a dagger aimed at its back. Chapter 17, The Queen's Judgment. Lord Kaelin, trapped and exposed, did the only thing a desperate wolf could do. He drew his sword. With a roar of pure, treasonous fury, he lunged not at Theron, but at me. If I am to fall, he bellowed, I will take the witch with me. The court erupted in screams. The royal guard surged forward, but Kaelin was too close, too fast. Time seemed to slow. Theron moved to intercept him, but he wouldn't be fast enough. I saw the flash of steel, the hatred in Kaelin's eyes. But I was no longer Seraphina the nanny. I was a queen, and the mate to an alphaking. I did not flinch. I did not scream. I stood my ground, reached out with my power, and instead of projecting a general calm, I focused my entire will, the full force of my heart healer magic, directly at the single, raging soul of Lord Kaelin. It was like throwing a bucket of icy water onto a roaring flame. He froze mid-stride, his sword arm faltering just inches from my throat. The murderous rage in his eyes was instantly extinguished, replaced by a vast, empty confusion. The anger that had fueled his entire being was just gone. His sword clattered to the floor from his nerveless fingers. He stumbled, falling to his knees before me, not in surrender, but in a state of profound, spiritual shock. He looked up at me, his eyes empty, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. The hall was utterly silent, every soul bearing witness to an act of magic more powerful and terrifying than any blade. I had not harmed him. I had not attacked him. I had simply unmade him. I had taken away the rage that was the core of his identity. Theron was at my side in an instant, his body a shield, his hand resting on my back, a silent, proud support. He looked down at the broken man at my feet, then at the stunned council. Lord Valerius, Theron said, his voice resonating with cold, absolute authority. You and every lord who stood with this traitor are stripped of your titles and lands. You will be imprisoned to await judgment. The royal guards, no longer hesitant, moved swiftly, apprehending the stunned and leaderless traitors. Valerius, his face ashen, did not resist. He simply stared at me with horrified awe. Theron then turned to me. In front of the entire assembly, he knelt on one knee, taking my hand. The law demands a traitor's life, he said, his voice clear and formal, yet filled with a deep, personal reverence. But your magic is a new law. As my queen, I ask for your judgment. What is to be done with Lord Kaelin? All eyes were on me. This was the true test. Would I be a queen of vengeance or of mercy? I looked down at the empty shell of a man who had tried to kill me. To execute him would be easy. But my power was not about destruction. It was about balance. He has been a poison to this kingdom for years, feeding its fear and anger for his own gain. I said, my voice steady. But his rage is gone. Let him live, but not in a dungeon. Banish him to the northernmost territories, to live as a common man. Let him see what it is to rebuild a life without a title, without anger, and without power. Let his punishment be a life of peace. My judgment was met with a profound silence, and then a single lord began to clap. Soon, the entire hall was filled with applause. It was a sound of absolute acceptance. I had shown them not only my power, but my wisdom. I was not just their salvation, I was their queen. Chapter 18, the scars of a king. In the quiet aftermath of the assembly, with the traitors imprisoned and the kingdom's loyalty secured, a new era of peace began. But the deepest wounds were not political. That night, after the castle had finally settled, Theron led me not to the grand royal chambers, but to a small, private study he had never shown me before. The room was filled with books and maps, but one wall was dominated by a large, exquisitely detailed portrait. It was of a beautiful she-wolf with silver blonde hair and eyes the color of a summer sky. Lyra's mother, the late queen. Theron stood before it, his expression one of deep, sorrowful reverence. "This was Alara," he said, his voice soft. "My first mate, my childhood friend." He had never spoken her name to me before. He turned to me, and the look in his eyes was raw, vulnerable. The king was gone, leaving only the man. The bond one had with her, it was one of friendship, of duty. I loved her, but it was a gentle love. The mating bond was not as ferocious as ours. When she was killed in a rogue attack while traveling, a part of me died with her. The grief, mixed with the curse, it turned me to stone. He reached out and traced the edge of my mating mark with a gentle finger. And then you came. This bond, it's a wildfire, Seraphina. It's a storm. It didn't just replace the love I lost. It resurrected a part of me I thought was dead forever. But I feel as if I am betraying her memory. The confession was heartbreaking. His coldness, his rejection of me, hadn't just been about politics or the curse. It had been about guilt. Guilt for feeling a passion for me that he had never felt for his lost queen. I stepped closer, taking his hand in mine. I didn't speak. Instead, I reached out through our perfected bond and touched his memories. I showed him not my own thoughts, but the echo of his own love for Alara. I let him feel the warmth of that gentle, dutiful love, and then I let him feel the blazing, all-consuming fire of his love for me. I showed him they were not at war. They were two different songs, both beautiful. One was a gentle lullaby, and the other was a grand, sweeping symphony. Sweeping symphony. Tears streamed down his face, the first tears he had allowed himself to shed in 5 long years. He pulled me into his arms, burying his face in my hair, and he wept. He wept for his lost friend, for his years of loneliness, and for the overwhelming, terrifying relief of finally being able to love again. I held him, my own tears falling freely. I was not just his mate, his queen, his cure. I was his confessor, his solace. I was healing the final, deepest scar, the one on his heart. Chapter 19, A Family in the Light. The nursery, once my gilded cage, became the heart of our new life. It was no longer a place of secrets and shadows, but of light and laughter. The pups, sensing the profound shift in their father, blossomed. Leo, once a quiet, solemn child, became boisterous and joyful. Lyra, who carried her mother's image, would sit on Theron's lap, her small hand often resting on his, a silent, comforting presence. Our family was a strange, beautiful tapestry woven from threads of old grief and new love. One afternoon, as I was telling the children a story, Theron came to join us. He didn't sit in a chair, but lowered his large frame to sit on the floor with us, pulling Leo into his lap. He caught my eye over the children's heads, and the look he gave me was one of pure, unadulterated happiness. He was no longer just a king burdened by his crown. He was a father, a husband, a mate. We began to rule not just from the throne, but from this room. Lords and emissaries, at first shocked, grew accustomed to having their meetings interrupted by a giggling toddler or a request for a bedtime story. My presence, my calming influence, had changed the very nature of Theron's reign. He was still a powerful, decisive king, but his rule was now tempered with a wisdom and compassion that won him the unshakable loyalty of his people. The rumors about my barrenness had vanished, replaced by a deep respect for my unique gift. The people saw that a strong kingdom was built not just on heirs, but on a foundation of peace and balance. They saw that I had given their king and their kingdom something far more valuable than another pup. I had given them a future free from the cycle of rage and war. One evening, as we put the children to bed together, Theron turned to me, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked. "The quiet, the invisibility, the life you had before." I looked at the 2 sleeping children, their faces peaceful and angelic in the soft light of the hearth. I felt the steady, warm presence of my mate beside me, a comforting weight in my soul. I thought of the shadow I used to be, the lonely, silent ghost in the halls. That wasn't a life, I said softly, turning to face him. I reached up and cupped his jaw, feeling the familiar, reassuring strength of him. It was just a long, quiet waiting. I was waiting for you. For this. He leaned down and kissed me, a slow, deep kiss filled with the comfortable, profound love of two souls who had finally found their way home. And I, he murmured against my lips, was a king lost in the dark, waiting for my dawn. Chapter 20. The Queen's Coronation. My coronation was held not in the cold, formal throne room, but in the great courtyard of the castle, open to the sky and to all the people of the kingdom. It was Theron's decree. He wanted my reign to begin not in the shadows of power, but in the light of day, witnessed by everyone from the highest lord to the humblest farmer. I walked towards the dais not as an outcast, but as a beloved queen. The path was lined with my people, their faces filled with hope and reverence. They threw flowers at my feet, lavender and chamomile, the humble herbs of the Nanny I once was, a sign that they had not forgotten where I came from, and they loved me for it. At my side walked Leo and Lyra, their small hands clutching mine. They were not just the king's heirs. They were my children, my heart. Theron waited for me on the dais, his eyes shining with a love so powerful it was a visible light. He had traded his heavy, oppressive iron crown for a simpler, more elegant silver circlet that spoke not of burden, but of grace. As I reached him, he did not wait for the high priest to speak. He took the queen's crown, a delicate, beautiful thing crafted to look like intertwined willow branches, and placed it on my head himself. I crown myself with anger and grief, he said, his voice ringing out for all to hear. But you, Seraphina, have crowned our kingdom with peace and our family with love. You are the heart of us all. He leaned in and kissed me before the entire kingdom, a long, loving kiss that sealed our past and promised our future. The roar of the crowd was a physical wave of joy and acceptance. Later that night, we stood on the balcony of our chambers, the sleeping castle spread out below us. The pups were safe in the nursery, now watched over by a happy, doting Alara. For the first time, it was just the two of us, king and queen, husband and wife, mate and mate. I leaned my head against his shoulder, my crown feeling not like a weight, but like a natural part of me. The boy who had been burdened by his crown, and the girl who had been a servant in the shadows were gone. In their place stood a man who had found his peace, and a woman who had found her power. I used to take care of his pups while others were at the mating ceremony, I whispered, the memory feeling like a lifetime ago. Theron wrapped his arm around me, pulling me closer. And then the Alpha King walked in, he finished, his voice a low, happy rumble against my ear, and finally found his way home. Our journey had begun with an unwanted claim in the dark of a lonely nursery. But it had led us here, to a new dawn, to a kingdom healed, to a family made whole. And we knew, with the certainty of two souls perfectly aligned, that this was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of our forever.